So it is now my pleasure to introduce you all to our second keynote for today, Anna Ma-Wyatt from the University of Adelaide in South Australia. Anna has a PhD from Macquarie University and is currently a professor in psychology at the University of Adelaide. She's also co-director of IRL Crossing, which is a French-Australian research lab focusing on teaming between humans and autonomous agents. It's a joint lab with CNRS, and since CNRS Alongside is one of our supporters, that's pretty awesome. Her work focuses on how human visual information is used to plan and execute interactive movements, as well as visual field loss and applied problems in vision. So her talk today is titled Human-Machine Collaboration, New Challenges and New Opportunities. So thank you so much for joining us today, Anna.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very sorry I can't be there in person. I'm just coming to you from Adelaide, and thank you very much for the introduction. So I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes at the beginning just introducing Crossing, which is our joint international research lab. So we're a CNRS lab, but we're based in Adelaide, and so we're a bit of an unusual IRL in that we have 6 partners as opposed to 2, and we're also the 5th IRL in the world to have an industrial partner, and ours is Naval Group. So the partners in Crossing are EMT Atlantique, University of South Australia, Flinders University, and the University of Adelaide, which is my home institution. And so the impetus for Crossing was really we're a bunch of people from disparate backgrounds who were thinking about how artificial agents, smart and autonomous systems were becoming more and more prevalent in working and living environments across many areas. So Industry 4.0, health, connected consumers and leisure activities, which sort of fits in quite well with the previous excellent talk. And one of the things the questions we were starting to ponder was really how do we manage a hybrid team to improve and augment human performance? And so we're imagining that you can have different forms of hybrid teams. So for example, here here you might have a bunch of humans working together. You could have a human working with a single AI agent or machine. So you might think of that as a single augmented operator where the human is being assisted by the machine or the AI enabled agent. You might have an augmented team where you primarily have a group of humans who are sort of aided by a AI agent. You might have an augmented team manager who is actually looking after, who's looking after a bunch of AI agents, and you have one human supervising that. And another aspect that we're quite interested in is dynamic hybrid team management. So say, for example, you have an integrated team consisting of humans and AI-enabled agents, and the distribution of work might change over time depending on the context. So how do you go about building structures to support this type of thing? So our scientific roadmap really is around hybrid teaming with a multidisciplinary approach. So the way we're conceptualizing it, these problems that we want to work on together are really problems that are at the confluence of human factors, artificial intelligence, behavioral neuroscience, engineering, and computer science. And so we've been very fortunate to bring together a bunch of people from those different backgrounds. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So we've got 4 thrusts to our work. We've got new ways of understanding human performance, which is thinking about how if we've got such a collaborative work environment, we need to leverage what we know about human performance and the neural substrates of behaviour from behavioural neuroscience and psychology and human factors. But we need to think about how we can translate that into a more complex and more open environment. And so in that respect, we're looking at new metrics of human performance that are developed by working with AI experts. And so thinking about what forms of human behaviour are meaningful, how do we describe context, how do we capture context with human performance as well. The second one is really new algorithms for efficient human-based AI. So this is driven by AI experts, and these are AI algorithms that are developed to be used with humans and may even be leveraging aspects of human approaches to problems. The third thrust is around new paradigms for autonomous systems and human interactions. And this is really about thinking about new types of autonomous systems that work well with humans, for human autonomy teaming, and also thinking about new forms of interfaces that support autonomous systems and human interactions. And on that side, we're very fortunate to have a whole bunch of great people who work in mixed reality, augmented reality, and virtual reality there too. And the fourth thrust, which is really our system of systems problem, is if you have all these different hybrid teams, how do you actually manage them? So say, for example, you're in a hospital environment or you're on a ship and you've got different types of hybrid teams that are wanting to work together. How do you keep track of what's going on? How do you actually understand how they're all working together? And so to do that, we think that's more of a systems engineering problem, but it's about thinking about how we have managements of hybrid teams. So why are we in Adelaide? We're fortunate to have a bunch of people from the Australian Institute for Machine Learning, which is a sort of a very highly ranked institute for machine learning and artificial intelligence. We've also got experts in human factors and behavioural neuroscience, so the Behaviour Brain Body Research Centre at UniSA, my own lab, the Active Vision Lab at the University of Adelaide, and we also have the Australian Research Centre for Interactive and Virtual Environments, who are experts in augmented reality, virtual reality and mixed reality. And we also have facilities at Flinders for autonomous systems and also emulation of a factory floor with a facility called Line Zero. And we also have a common lab space that can be linked back into those. And there's a few of us blinking in the sunlight out in front of the lab there. So to come back to so I just wanted to give you a sort of an overview of the kinds of sort of what the scope of the lab is. And I guess more specifically, we've been thinking about human AI collaboration. So I wanted to talk more broadly about the types of issues and how, what we think could be a good theoretical and also practical approach to working on these problems with a multidisciplinary approach. So we've got a human, and we've got an AI agent embodied in some form, whether that's a system or a robot or an agent, an algorithm. So one of the questions really is who does what, right? So we all know that this is the problem. And I think the bigger problem that we've been thinking about a lot is who knows what who is doing. So how do we know which one is doing what thing at a given time, and how much do we need to know in order to have an effective team? So first of all, I want to just take you a step back first and think about human information processing. So human information processing starts with sensory processing. And this is a very sort of old school diagram of the brain, but it shows you, and some of you may recognize this from some of your undergraduate textbooks, but this is just to remind you that we have very specialized sensory areas within cortical areas that rely on inputs from particular sensory systems. This information then, of course, is shared amongst different areas of the brain. So there are, as we know now, there are feed forward and feedback loops from different areas and circuits that underlie complex behaviour. But it's worth remembering that really the first step before information processing is sensory processing. So for an example, we have early visual processing, and this is a diagram that comes from a lovely review paper by Solomon and Lenny in Nature Neuroscience. And even just something as simple as getting from, some light coming in onto your retina to V1, which is the first cortical area of visual processing, you have many different layers of information transformation. So you're getting a little bit of light coming in onto the back of your retina. It's being picked up by your photoreceptors. And even before it's left the retina, you have transformation of that information many times through the horizontal cells, bipolar cells, amacrine cells, and ganglion cells. And from there, you then have projections to the lateral geniculate nucleus, which in itself has many different layers of information processing. And then on to V1, which again has specialized layers of processing, which then have projections to higher cortical areas. And so I guess the thing that I want to show through this example is the human sensory processing is limited. So we are limited by the capacity of our given senses. So for example, here, these are the same spatial frequency at the bottom of the top in this diagram, but here it's quite low contrast and here it's quite high contrast. So they sort of look like black and white bars here. And you can see the difference between the black and the white. Intensity level gets less as we go up here. And hopefully what you can see is you can only see up to about here or so. And I guess what this shows is that sensory processing has limitations. So we can only see, our inferences about the world are only as good as our sensory receptors, but also on how it's also limited by the types of inferences that we make on the basis of that information. And we know that human sensory processing is limited, so we're only sensitive to certain wavelengths of light, for example. This is a representation of human sensitivity to light across the visible spectra. But we also know that human perception and cognition are really based on inference. So this is a really nice diagram of an illusion first reported by a guy called Ma-Wyatt in 1979. And here we have black and white bars, and these areas of grey are actually exactly the same value. They're exactly the same grey, but because this one is lying on top of the black and it has a longer boundary with the white. It appears what I hope you see as lighter here and darker here. Does everybody see that? Yeah. Okay, so I guess this is just a nice example to show that, what we have is not a direct representation of the world outside, that our perception of it is really based on the inferences that our brains make. So for human AI collaboration, we need to remember that we have these very fine sensors, but we have outstanding inferences on the basis of pretty sparse data. So humans are quick to learn and they're resilient. They can take different pieces of information and make quick decisions. They're also able to anticipate performance, and they're able to anticipate behaviour within a group and within an individual setting. And they're also able to imagine alternatives. And they do this at a more creative, sort of higher level conceptual thinking, planning out the future, thinking about, different pathways to get to a different location for wayfinding. But the human brain also does it at an incredibly basic level, just in terms of movement planning of the hand. You find that if you're reaching out to something and you've got multiple alternatives, after a few trials, the brain starts to represent each of those particular trajectories and imagines the outcome for each of those, and then waits until it has enough information to release that particular movement. AI, on the other hand, obviously has a fantastic ability. It's been used spectacularly to find very interesting patterns in very large data sets. But at the moment, most of the AI that we use relies on large training sets. It can be fragile at times or brittle. It's not always quick to learn. Often you need quite large training sets, although we have an extremely clever PhD student from École Normale Supérieure who's working on few-shot learning at the moment with us at Crossing. So we know that that's obviously a very hot topic at the moment, and could lead to some changes in the future. But I guess those differences highlights how humans and AIs collaborate, or can they collaborate effectively in a team. What we have are two very strong entities which have very different timescales for information processing, very different ways of making decisions, and very different ways of considering what the ground truth is for a given situation or a given problem. And another question that we return to again and again is, how does trust get established and how is it actually calibrated? So how do you decide that you believe the inferences that are being made by this AI system, and how much information do you need to do that? And this is something that humans do within groups and within teams regularly. And obviously, of course, it's known that you don't need perfect access to another person's thinking in order to be able to trust what they're doing. But you do need to be able to develop a relationship with that other human in order to build that foundation of trust. So there has been a bunch of work done on human teams and what makes an effective human team. Can we start from that as an example? And some characteristics of effective human teams are things like shared situational awareness, good dialogue, load sharing, resilience and flexibility. So being able to change the load sharing depending on the complexity of the problem or the danger of the particular people who are in a given situation, for the firefighting example. So can we learn from that in order to build better hybrid teams? So then I think the question is, how do we conceptualize how you share information between a team and between different members of the team when they're human-based and they're AI-based. So this is an example from a guy called Chris Becker, who's works extensively in UX design. And I think it just sort of nicely describes that when we think about human interaction or human-centered, we think very much on a sensory processing kind of basis and thinking about how you're gathering information on a particular thing. If we're thinking about interaction design, we're thinking about artificial intelligence and how it can inform the development essentially of software that then drives those mechanisms. So we've got quite strong we're thinking about information that's been transformed many, many times before it gets between the human and the AI. So the question I think that we want to consider is, can we have more direct interaction between the human and the AI? And are we conceptualizing that representation of information at the appropriate level to enable effective hybrid teaming? So should we think about it as mimicking sensory substitution? So are we going to consider, the sensory processing that humans do? And there's some work we're doing in this area looking at information systems that people wear. Is that helpful, or does that actually hinder people? We've done work previously in this area suggesting that it can actually be a hindrance. What do we need to establish a common ground? So if you are talking to a colleague and you're saying, let's go and get a cup of coffee, or let's go to the break now. You don't have to have a perfect representation of what each other is thinking at that particular time, but you do need enough to establish what that common ground is, that you have an unequivocal, representation of coffee and now and how to execute those actions. So how do we do that, and how do we know what good looks like for that? And we also, hope that what we're building, really, like any good team, a hybrid team where we leverage the strengths of each member of the team to make a more efficient team overall. So this is something that, a lot of smart people have been thinking about. This diagram comes from the DARPA website, and it's thinking about using AI to build better teams. And I think this diagram nicely highlights just the importance of context. Humans are extremely sensitive to context. They're very resilient in changing contexts. The question then, I think, if we're moving to trying to understand human performance in a more naturalistic environment, is how do you capture context, and what is the appropriate level of representation for that context in order to be able to understand human performance, and also to understand if the AI is actually genuinely augmenting performance and building a better team. So what's our ground truth there? Because the reality is, we study things in the lab, but if we're thinking about AI agents in a real environment, operational environments are really complex. So this is just an example of one from a submarine environment in the Australian Navy. And you can see that these are crowded environments that are noisy, dark, poorly lit, lots of buttons, lots of flashing lights, lots of different sources of information coming in. If we have AI agents that are part of, we think about abstraction of certain parts of this system and how to think about embedding AI agents within these complex systems. But I think one of the really critical questions here is, what's the right level of abstraction to be thinking about hybrid teams? Are we thinking about just taking out one small chunk, or are we thinking about a system of systems approach to better understand performance? And here I think there's an opportunity to think about that level of representation at many parts of this idea of building AI, using AI to build better teams. So the key challenges for new forms of human AI collaboration, we think, is what's the right level of abstraction to share information about the agent and the human? What's theory of mind for a hybrid team interacting with other humans and other AI agents? What do you need to understand about how they're making decisions in order to feel comfortable that you're making decisions well together? And how do we actually quantify trust and its impact on system level performance? What should we be measuring to show that it's efficient? And how do we think flexibly about what that means in different environments? And I think that with a lot of this, implicit in a lot of these types of paradigms or these types of scenarios we imagine is very careful measurement of the human and very careful measurement of the system, because we can take a lot of data now. There's lots of sensors. But the question then is, who gets that data? How do we keep that data private? Who owns that data? Who gets to decide who owns that data? And what ethical guidelines are used to set up those structures and to monitor these activities? And how do we understand that? How do we implement ethical guidelines to program AI algorithms? So we have a really interesting new project that's just started with LabStick, a collaboration between LabStick and University of Adelaide through Crossing, where we're looking at how to implement ethical guidelines in scheduling in operations research. So how do we ensure also that there's genuine dialogue in our society about these problems? This is sort of a much bigger question, but I think it's important that, you see a lot of surveys that say, I'm scared of AI. And then the second question is, what is AI? And people say, well, they have different ideas about what it might be. So how do we actually make sure that there's genuine dialogue that's built on genuine understanding of these particular problems? And what's the right regulatory environment? At the moment, I know that the EU is moving to regulate the development of AI algorithms and how that's used, and having, culpability for those types of decisions that are made in the development of the algorithms. Australia is working on that now and looking to the EU to see the decisions that they've made in that space. But that's, I think, a really interesting question when we're thinking especially about a complex hybrid system. Where do you draw the boundaries about what's the system and, who's responsible for what part? So that's all I had today. The last part is just an an invitation to come and visit us. Our website is crossing.cnrs.fr. We have mechanisms for collaboration within Crossing, and at the moment we also are fortunate to be running a scheme to encourage mobility between Adelaide and CNRS. So this is to help French researchers come to Adelaide, and also people from Adelaide to travel to CNRS labs. So if any of this piques your interest, please feel free to send me an email. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for the excellent talk. I will now open up the floor for questions. So for those of you in the room, feel free to raise your hands, and just remember, we've got the mic here. So if you could come up and introduce yourself and speak into the mic, that would be awesome. For those of you on Zoom, Kathy is watching the chat if you'd prefer to share questions there, and you can also use the raise hand function. Kathy, if you could tell me if there's somebody with a question online, I would really appreciate that.
No trouble.
All right, any questions?
So thank you for a very interesting talk. I've got a question about the teaming metaphor that you mentioned several times. So sometimes we might want to think about even bigger structures than just a team, because the way maybe organizations, or maybe maybe sometimes team could also may not be the right metaphor, because it may raise too high expectations for the humans working with these robotic teammates, because they may not, it may lead them to anthropomorphize about them. So I would like to hear your thoughts about that. And some people have, for example, argued that maybe it's better to talk about AI more as electricity or something which is there that you can plug into. So it's a totally different metaphor. So I would, what are your thoughts about that? What about the teaming metaphor, and whether it's appropriate, or that we maybe should also think about other ways of thinking about these systems?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I think that it's really interesting, I think, in that people tend to anthropomorphize robots, for example. So we have a robot, so we have a guy called Cedric Bush, who's on delegation from CNRS in the lab at the moment, and Cedric's team just won the RoboCup at Home, which is like a human-robot interaction in a home environment competition that's held every year. And interestingly, Pepper is about the size of a 6-year-old girl, and everyone calls her her. Everyone has the expectation that they want to think of her as, another human who's, sort of interacting with them. But I think you're right. I think it's really interesting because you notice we've had lots of, different students come in, and my own daughter come in to interact with her. And you can see that people start to change their calibration of how they're interacting, which I think is really interesting as well. So they are starting to, they adjust, the way they're moving, the way they're talking and they're interacting, because they realize quite quickly that Pepper is not, like a robot you see in a movie who can, run around and do Terminator type things. So I think that's, I think it's a good point. We're using teaming in a very broad term, but I can totally see where you're coming from, that we need to think about it as I think that the way in which AI will be present in different work environments will vary a lot. And I think that there are some, I think that in some environments, perhaps some operational environments like air traffic or in surveillance, where the AI agent might be taking on a part of the pre-information processing, which may have been done by a human previously, in which case you might think of them as a team member there. But in other instances, I think there are instances where it's almost sort of doing like a pre-processing kind of level that is so level that can be almost automated out of the system, that becomes sort of, like the clutch in a car, where you don't really need to think about it anymore, in which case it's maybe not helpful to think of that as a team. It's just another component. But I think the challenge really is, how to think about this in different complex environments. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yep. Is there a question online?
There is, Liz. I can't.
What are we?
Sorry, you go.
go ahead with the online question and we can be next after that.
Thanks.
So Amir, thank you very much for your talk and for your compliment. How do you go about evaluating dynamic human AI teams in complex environments? Is it a matter of choosing the right metrics, or do we need to develop different approaches to evaluate team performance? I think I agree with you. I think it's both, really. I think that we need new types of metrics to think about human performance, definitely. I'm obviously a little bit biased there, being a behavioural scientist by training. But I think we also need to think about new ways of evaluating team performance as a whole as well. And I think, and my other thought really is that we need a way of embedding context within that, in the way that we're describing team performance within a particular setting. I hope that answers your question, but please let me know if it doesn't.
We just have a question in the room. She's going to come over to the mic. Introduce yourself.
Hello, thank you for your interesting talk. My name is Marlijn Heijnen. I'm from TNO. I was wondering, I was really struck by your last questions. You mentioned a question about what's the right regulatory environment and what does the system look like, who plays which part. And I wondered if you had any ideas on that already.
No, to be... Oh, sorry, you go. Sorry, I just missed the last part of your question.
Yeah, how the system should look like, for instance, or can look like.
Yeah, I have to say that's really beyond my skill set, to be honest. We've been talking to, so there's an organisation in Australia called CSIRO, which is a little bit like the CNRS, but not as large in scope. And we've been talking to some great people there in a group called Data 61 who are looking, one lady in there in particular called Aurélie Jacquet, who's French originally and a lawyer by training, but who's looking at developing new guidelines for the regulatory environment. And I think it's really interesting to see how lawyers are driving the policy and the policy changes, because really they're the ones who are going to be, writing the regulations that get implemented, because in Australia anyway, that tends to be the way the regulatory environment works. But I think that what has been pleasing to see, at least here, is that there has been quite a few efforts being made to engage with scientists in the area as well, to try and understand, what's a reasonable way of representing responsibility within these contexts. But I think it's still an open question, to be honest. I mean, I think it's something we need to be mindful of as we're, trying to work in these environments and trying to develop these approaches. But I'm afraid I don't have the answer. Be interested in any thoughts that you have on the topic as well.
Well, I've definitely an interest in the topic, and I'm actually, I don't have the answers myself either, but I'd be very interested to explore what what the alternatives are, and
Yeah. Oh, please feel free to email me, and of course, the gentleman asked the question earlier as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the question. Any questions online or in the room?
Yes, we have a question here. We actually have two questions from Felicity. Felicity's written them into chat there, so I'm going to ask them on her behalf. The first question for Anna is re-understanding theory of mind in these scenarios. Are there any parallels to human-animal teams? Both agents can be autonomous but can interact as a team. Can this help us understand the situation differently? What features support humans to infer intent and action for machines and robots?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that's a really interesting point. And I think it's also the case that, I guess I have two answers to that question. One is that in my way back many years ago, I used to study motion perception in humans, and interestingly enough, insect models of motion are very similar to human models of motion because then it turns out that there's something called a Reichardt detector, which was developed by a fellow called Reichardt, who went on to found the Max Planck Institute in Germany. And he basically showed that that insects were coding certain dimensions of information in the environment that were meaningful for representing motion. And then it turned out that this model was a really good account of human motion perception as well. And I guess I've always sort of, I often come back to that idea, and, that this is sort of a current idea in, in terms of, more ecological approaches to human performance and action as well, in the sense that you learn affordances in the environment and what's possible and what's not. And therefore, that's the information that's relevant if you're trying to navigate through a room. And I think that we have some really interesting conversations in the lab, actually, with people from AI and from, computer science, thinking about, because there was like a common link between computer vision and human vision, sort of, in the 80s with David Murray, and then they kind of split off as, computers got more and more powerful and you could just make up other approaches. But it's really interesting because often the biologically inspired way is actually really efficient. And so I think now, as we're thinking more and more about the costs of, computing and energy, we're coming back to the idea of, okay, are there these shortcuts that we could use? Like, is there this very efficient way of coding like meaningful dimensions of behavior in the environment? And maybe that's all we need, like we just need to know that doorway's big enough. Let's both go through it, if that answers your question. Yeah, cool. And your second question, the theory of mind issue in complex environments always made me think of the sidewalk. So yes, me too. Yes. And then both step in the same direction repeatedly to avoid collision with each other. Yeah, I think does the pace or level of complexity of the interaction have any impact on this type of situation? Do you see any of these types of co-processing loops in the hybrid teams you work with? That's a really excellent question, actually. We haven't seen that type of co-processing loops in the hybrid teams we work with, but now I want to look for them. That's really cool. Yeah, that's a great idea. I think you're absolutely right. I think it's really interesting to look at how these things change with the tempo of the information environment. And also, I think, like with the other thing that I'm really excited to try and work on next year is longer form experiments where you're looking at this collaboration over time and seeing how that changes. You know what I mean? So do you get less sidewalk salsa over the time? But yeah, feel free to email me if you're interested. Cool. Thank you.
Excellent. Any questions in the room? If not, I have a question for you, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure.
I wanted to ask, you pointed out that you have some fairly multidisciplinary teams, and I'm kind of wondering, what are some of the main challenges you observe for your work within those teams? And also, how do you go about addressing those, particularly in terms of thinking about the impact of that on the outputs or outcomes from those collaborations?
Yeah, it's a hard thing, to be honest. I think anybody who works, I come from, I started out in vision science, which is quite a multidisciplinary area. So there tend to be people, who come from psychology, working next to optometrists and ophthalmologists and, electrical engineers and physicists. So I kind of had some sort of understanding of the complexity of that kind of relationship previously, but you have some kind of common language in sort of, control theory or, signal processing. And I think that's kind of been our common language. But we have, I think whenever you're starting out with these multidisciplinary things, and now with Crossing, we have an even broader group where we have people who, come from an augmented reality, virtual reality background, or we even have some people from design. And a lot of, the first half hour of a new project meeting could be, what exactly do you mean when you say that? Could we just make sure we're, but I think, if you've got I think we came together as a group because we realized that there were cool problems that we wanted to work on in this space that no one discipline could solve on its own. And so we're sort of like highly motivated to, to find that common space where we can work together, and also to think about, how we can blend our approaches to come up with a better approach. But then, of course, the question is, multidisciplinary work is quite hard in terms of publishing because, journals tend to be more single track, and also funding mechanisms as well. It can be hard to do that. So I think that we're definitely seeing a bit of a steer in the field. I think there's getting to be more people who are interested in doing both types of things or multiple things. And we're training a lot more people in that way as well. And we're looking at other kind of mechanisms for training, because really, one of the outcomes that we hope for this lab is that we help bring together a bunch of, like a whole bunch of young scientists who are interested in these problems, who come from these different backgrounds and who learn to work together and to take, tools from either side. Like, I think that would be, if that's all we achieve, I think that would be pretty cool.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Any other questions? Right.
Hello, hi.
Hi.
Thanks for your presentation. My name is Lorraine. I'm from the School of Cybernetics. My PhD topic is not specifically in human-machine collaboration per se, but looking at the role of dignity in the creation of algorithms. And I was interested in your comments around how you're talking about effective human teams being like a way to think through then what the equivalents might look like for human-machine teams. So, and one of the sort of models that I've been looking into actually comes from international conflict resolution and the need to recognize dignity before you can actually negotiate through a conflict. Yeah. So I'm just wondering whether you've seen any sort of parallels in that sort of connecting what a human team sort of looks like and translating that with regards to this sort of idea of dignity or something that sits beneath the interaction itself. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think trust and respect go a huge way. I had a discussion with a colleague the other day about whether, was it trust or was it respect? Was it which comes first, or do you trust someone because you respect them and you understand the role that they play in a given situation? But I think you're absolutely right, because I think it comes to the point where you have to respect the role of that person, but also understand their agency in that environment and respect it, and respect the boundaries around that. So I think that's a really, really interesting analogy. And the other thing I was going to say is that we were fortunate enough to do some sort of like live experiments in an operational environment with the Air Force a couple of years ago. And one of the things that I found really fascinating was looking at these teams that were working in a pretty high pressure environment, but just looking at how flexible they were. These were people who, had been working together for a number of years, but, one member of the team had a new baby and was very tired. So they just sort of tried to work around him. On another shift, one member of the team was quite new to the position, but trying really hard. And so the others were just like gently guiding that person through. It was really interesting to see how flexible and effortless, well, from our perspective anyway, the allocation of work was. But I think underlying that was as you say, a respect. I mean, you put it as dignity, which I think is a really nice way of describing it. I was sort of thinking of it as, trust and respect, but I think there's definitely overlap in that. But I'd be interested to talk to you more about that if you have time sometime.
Yeah, love to. Thank you.
Cool.
Any other questions here or online?
There's no additional questions online. Thanks for checking, Liz.
Thank you. I've got one more question for you. You mentioned trust in your talk and looking at how that develops for these kinds of human-machine collaborations. I'm wondering how you think about that at scale. Like, for example, do you need to consider that relationship, the way that it forms or develops differently depending on where that's actually occurring? Or do you see patterns across multiple settings? Or is that something that you've looked at in your work?
We haven't looked at it, but I think that would be a really interesting thing to look at. I think at the moment, the measures of trust that we have currently are, I think maybe they tend to be more on the subjective ratings that are sort of taken after sort of at the end of a session, which, definitely has a place. And I think that with, like a mixed methods approach can be really powerful. I think one other way we're thinking about trust now, though, too, is just how that translates into differences in the performance of the team and also how that changes over longer periods of time. So in the beginning, you might imagine that just like you would with a new coworker, they make a few mistakes the first day. You're like, oh, never mind, it's okay. They make a few mistakes after you spend 3 weeks training them, and it's the same mistake again. You're kind of like, no, let me show you that one more time. It's sort of, I think that's one of the questions I'm quite interested in at the moment. But I think, to do that, we need these neural metrics that are also sort of, representative of what the context is.
I'll have to follow up with you on that, because that's something we are interested in. One of my PhD students in particular working at that in the context of autonomous vehicles in Nigeria.
So fantastic.
We're really interested in it. So I'll send you.
That'd be great. That'd be great.
Awesome. Any other questions or comments? Yep. See?
Hi, I'm Dee Pembry, and I'm from, I'm sort of like finishing my PhD in from the University of Hull, and I'm very interested in this because when I first started out, there wasn't this whole collaboration with the neurosciences and, artificial intelligence and behavioral science. I'm a systems scientist and a cybernetician. So when you're talking about systems of systems, I'm thinking, wow, that's excellent. And when we're talking about boundaries, and what I'm very interested in is actually thinking about, you said you were talking about the neurosciences, and I'm just wondering that when you're talking about human teaming, are you doing any experiments where, you can actually hook up people's brains, and while they're in a high performance, scenario, that we're actually able to observe what's actually happening in different people's minds, brains, and seeing what flashes up and what actually works. And then when you start, is any of that work sort of happening as well?
We're not doing it, but there is some stuff that people have done to look at. Actually, there is a group. Bruce Thomas's group within Crossing. So he's a professor at the University of South Australia, and he's the director of the Interactive Virtual Environment group that I mentioned earlier. He's been collaborating with a group of neuroscientists at UniSA, looking at measuring EEG while people are doing real tasks, and then looking at changing the load of what their task is as they're going. And I think that the next project that they've been looking at is having some kind of representation of the workload of one of your other teammates. So there's also another PhD project that's going at the moment, which is a collaboration between Guillaume Moreau at EMT Atlantic and Labstick and Bruce at UniSA, and they're looking at collaborative virtual environments where you have some representation of what the workload is of the other person, and then how you can, dynamically allocate work to them. But that one is a Wizard of Oz kind of scenario. So they're not actually measuring any kind of brain activity. I think the challenge probably is finding, sort of real-time measures that are robust to workload, because, EEG, it's pretty noisy. There's a lot of post-processing, and FNIRS is, faster, but, gives a certain kind of signal. But if you have any thoughts or,
Yeah, I do, because I'm
let me know.
Yeah, no, it's only I'm ex-Navy as well, so
cool.
Yeah, so when you sort of bringing up, these complex environments, that I think one of the scenarios that we're talking about is, you're talking about trust, but probably another word of, an operational sense of the word is actually psychological safety. Yeah. So when do you hit a level of psychological safety, or if there is a group of people hitting, psychological safety, that they're then able to, cross those, traverse those boundaries to then communicate further.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And I think it's also that, and I think I like the idea of psychological safety, because that allows you to, I think, even go further than trust. You know what I mean? Because I kind of feel like that then gives you a bigger envelope for interaction. Because then I kind of feel like in that that encompasses situations in which you can push someone on a decision. I feel safe to question you about why. That's the
throw them out of a plane. Okay. Look, thank you very much. I will be in touch. So
please do.
Thank you.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. Are there any online or in?
No further questions online, Liz. Thank you for checking.
Thank you. We've got one here. So
Hi, thanks for the talk. My name is Ming Wei. I'm from Carnegie Mellon University. So throughout the talk, you talked a lot about, kind of how they collaborate to sort of improve, I guess, the performance or the quality of the decision that's being made. I'm curious about what your thoughts are on accountability when you have collaboration between human and machines. So, I guess in addition to, collaborating and augmenting your ability, there should be some kind of interrogation going on, right?
Yeah.
I think like we have maybe more contextual information that the machines don't have access to. So I'm wondering, like, how do you build in that mechanism? And,
I think that's I think that's a really good question. And I think that in Australia, at least, I think that comes back somewhat to the regulatory environment. So within some sorts of contexts, it'll have to be a human who makes that decision, who makes the final say, because there has to be a human, who has the ethical and moral guidelines to make a decision with, which could have a certain negative outcome or a certain type of decision. And in that sense, I think that's a real challenge for encouraging people to rely on AI systems in some ways, because they think, oh, okay, I'm the one who's going to get into trouble if this goes wrong. Like, how do I make sure that, that this is the right decision that's being made within this context? I mean, what we've sort of seen anecdotally is that if it's a situation in which the human has huge domain expertise, they're sort of more confident in their decisions to use it or not, because they're like, okay, I understand the context of that. Okay, yep, no, that's great. That's really helpful. I'm going to use that piece of information, and I'm comfortable with the decision that I'm making overall on the basis of that. But I think you're absolutely right. The culpability and the outcomes are really important.
So just to follow up on that, I think one of your main research questions is about trying to understand who is doing what, right? As you mentioned earlier. So I'm wondering, do you think it's a fruitful direction in terms of research to try to sort of really make clear the different components of a decision? So either through some kind of documentation or like records or the way that we design the algorithm to make sure we know which sort of decision was made by human, what's made by machine, and sort of how people justify their decisions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think it will ever be kind of possible to like disentangle those decisions, or you will always sort of be dictated?
Yeah, we've had long discussions with some of our friends at AIML about this as well, actually, because I think there are some situations in which, so say with some deep neural nets or something, no one's 100% sure why that decision was made. And yet sometimes, there's another person who's a radiologist, like a doctor by training, who works at AIML as a research fellow. And she's really interested in looking at situations where using AI, you can get a better correct diagnosis rate than a human for radiology images, but for different reasons. It's making that diagnosis on features that humans wouldn't use. And I think that's a really interesting problem, because it's thinking about what the information content is of that thing in such a totally different way to the way a human would make the decision. How can the human be comfortable with that? What sort of explanations can you put in place that the human feels comfortable to sign off on that kind of decision? And I think then that comes back to sort of where we sit as a society in terms of what decisions we are comfortable to hand over to AI agents and not. So, but yeah,
thanks.
No, very interesting question. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. I think that's all the time we have. So I want to thank Anna one more time for her wonderful talk, and thank you all for your excellent questions.
Thanks so much.